Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
And as you know, today we are continuing on with our read of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism, and the Overthrow of Communism. And last time we read Communism in Wonderland, the most cursed chapter. Today we're going to read a much less cursed chapter, although there is one kind of funny sentence that Parenti does later on in the book, which we'll point out when we get there. And I will give you some relevant reading material to go along with it. But this is a pretty good chapter. It's chapter 5, Stalin's Fingers. Thankfully, that other chapter's behind us, yes. What, Bugga? You want me to help you up? You can make it to the top. Bugga's trying to get up to the top. She really wants to go up. Oh, Bug. Oh, good job, Bugga. Good girl, Bugga. What a climber. Wow. I honestly did not think she was gonna do that. Okay. Good job, Bugga. That was quite a climb for her. Everybody was like, lose 3 pounds and you'll make it up there, Bugga. Bugga says, what now? Hey, Bug. You're perfect just the way you were, aren't you, Bug? All right. Blackshirts and Reds. Chapter 5, Stalin's Fingers. In 1989-1991, remarkable transformations swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Communist governments were overthrown. Large portions of their publicly owned economies were dismantled and handed over to private owners at garage sale prices. And one-party rule was replaced with multi-party parliamentary systems. For Western leaders, who had tirelessly pursued the rollback of communism, it was a dream come true. If the overthrow of communism was a victory for democracy, as some claimed, it was even more a victory for free market capitalism and conservative anti-communism. Some of the credit should go to the CIA and other Cold War agencies, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, AFL-CIO, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and various right-wing groups, all of whom funded free market, anti-communist political organizations and publications throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In what swiftly became the best financed chain of revolutions, quote unquote, in history. The upheavals occurred with remarkably little violence. As Lech Walesa boasted in November 1989, Polish solidarity overthrew the communist government without breaking a single window. This says at least as much about the government that was overthrown as about the rebels. Rather than acting as US supported rulers in El Salvador, Colombia, Zaire, or Indonesia, with death squad terrorism and mass repression, the communists relinquished power almost without firing a shot. The relatively peaceful transition does not fit our image of unscrupulous totalitarians who stop at nothing to maintain power over captive population. Why didn't the ruthless Reds act more ruthlessly? How many victims? We have heard much about the ruthless Reds, beginning with the reign of terror and repression perpetrated during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, 1929 to 1953. Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule, based principally on speculations by writers who never reveal how they arrive at such figures, vary wildly. Thus, Roy Medvedev puts Stalin's victims to 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shutsevakia claims 19.8 million just for the 1935-40 period. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939, with 3 million executed or dying from mistreatment during the 1936-39 period. And Arthur Koestler tells us that it was 20 to 25 million. More recently, William Rusher of the Claremont Institute refers to the, quote, 100 million people who wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Unquote. Oakland Tribune, 1/22/1996. And Richard Laurie blames the Stalin era for the slaughter of millions, quote unquote. New York Times, 8/4/1996. Of course he did, Frank. To the surprise of no one, he wrote a 1984 style book. Unburdened by any documentation, these estimates, quote unquote, invite us to conclude that the sum total of people incarcerated in the labor camps over a 22-year period, allowing for turnovers due to death and term expirations, would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. The support and supervision of the Gulag, all the labor camps, labor colonies, and prisons of the Soviet Union system would have been the USSR's single largest enterprise. In the absence of reliable evidence, we are fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both of his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded, without benefit of clarifying follow-up questions, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. Would the head of one state, especially the secretive Stalin, casually prefer such a admission to the head of another? To this day, Western writers treat this this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. What do we know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, and here's where it's gonna get weird here. This part. So what's gonna happen is here basically Parenti, just to give you a heads up before we get to here, Parenti's gonna basically have no understanding or view of the Moscow trials, why they happened, how many other communist parties around the world at the time, including the Canadian Communist Party, CPUSA, and many others, were witnesses at the Moscow trials, and all concluded that yes, the charges of fifth column elements in the USSR being the cause of much of these repressions for the sake of trying to stir up like revolt against the Soviet government was a very real thing. You can look at works by Tim Buck of the Communist Party of Canada, who talks about this. Many others as well, about the Moscow trials. And it was members from NKVD and other leadership that basically were working as fifth columnist elements for like the Nazis in order to try and undermine the USSR for money or whatever the fuck reasons they were doing it for, which is why Yezhev was found guilty in the Moscow trials. And isn't it curious that after isn't it curious that with the conclusion of the Moscow trials, also the mass repression ended? Almost like the people who were guilty were found guilty and removed. You see. But, you know, for some reason, Parenti just like does not even consider the Moscow trials, and even goes into this weird territory. Well, you'll see in a second. He'll say like, all of a sudden, these NKVD leaders and others were found guilty. Well, it's like not all of a sudden. Evidence came forward. It was presented in a large public trial that, like, again, international bodies observed, and the evidence of them being guilty was fucking overwhelming. Like I said, even like the Canadian Communist Party and others admitted, yes, the evidence was fucking real and true. It was pretty clear that there was this fifth columnist element, and they were not responding to orders or communications from the Communist Party. That the NKVD was essentially acting on its own under the leadership of Yezhov. And again, if you want to read more about this, I do have this article from Grover Fur here, 24 pages. We'll read this after we're done Blackshirts and Reds all the way. But this is Yezhov versus Stalin, the causes of the mass repressions of the 1937-38 USSR. I don't know if this talks about the Moscow trials specifically, but it does talk about what exactly was going on there. And it was the Trotskyists who were engaged in this shit. Who, since the days of Trotsky, essentially formed this not weird, but this fifth columnist fucking sect against the USSR leadership because they didn't like the idea of, like, these colonized people leading the Russias. In part. And they saw themselves, like, more aligned with fucking fascists. So, take that what you will about Trotskyism. Anyway, so now let me continue. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom the dictator saw fit to incarcerate or liquidate. And again, like, purge generally means you're kicked out of the party. Find a different job. Doesn't mean you're fucking... The people who were arrested were found guilty of some serious fucking crimes in the Moscow trials. Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, it's funny though, Jeremiah, because he talks about like fighting against this type of framing in most of this book. But then when it comes to Stalin, he sort of like is unable to do that himself. It's kind of wild to see. Hey Kubashi, welcome. In addition, whole categories of people whom Stalin considered unreliable loyalty. And again, it wasn't Stalin that considered them unreliable loyalty and cause of this mass repression. It was NKVD working for like Nazi fucking espionage elements that were the cause of this mass repression. So Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Germans were selected for internal deportation. Again, not a policy that came from the Central Committee, a policy that came from NKVD leadership. Though they never saw the inside of a prison or labor camp, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement in Central Asia and Siberia. To be sure, crimes of the state were committed in communist countries, and many political prisoners were unjustly interned and even murdered. Sure, like I say, in any socialist country, that is undeniably the case. That absolutely can happen and will happen, and it's sad. But the revolution isn't a dinner party. But the inflated numbers offered by Cold War scholars serve neither historical truth nor the cause of justice, but merely help to reinforce a knee-jerk fear and loathing of those terrible Reds. In 1993, for the first time, several historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives and were able to establish well-documented estimates of prison and labor camp populations. They found that the total population of the entire Gulag, as of January 1939, I remind you, during World War II, near the end of the Great Purges, was about 2,022,976. And now, here's where he's going to do the weird thing. Listen to what he says here. Now he goes, at about the same time, there began a purge of the purgers, including many intelligence and secret police. Why? I wonder that was happening. Officials and members of the judiciary and other investigative committees who were suddenly held responsible for the excesses of terror despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. And his source for this is J. Arch Getty, Gabor Ritterspan, and Viktor Zemnov, victims of the Soviet penal system in the pre-war years. A review approach on the basis of archival evidence. So he's citing Arch Getty there. And again, so like, he's sort of like, it's weird how he goes, you know, they were suddenly held responsible for the excesses of terror despite their protestations of loyalty to the regime. The problem was, like, they claimed that they were loyal to the regime, but evidence showed that they were working for these other elements, not responding to the fucking... Like I said, very clear evidence showed they were not even responding to the Central Committee or to other party bodies. And NKVD was just acting independently, seemingly. For some other like orders, which again, if you read that article I showed you, they talk about. Anyway, to continue, Soviet labor camps were not death camps like those the Nazis built across Europe. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of bodies. Despite harsh conditions, the great majority of Gulag inmates survived and eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their terms were finished. So it's weird here that, too, Parenti admits that Soviet Union granted amnesty multiple times, even during the Stalin period. How many times did the US ever grant general amnesty again? Does anyone even know what that term means if you live in the US? In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released, according to archive records. Oblivious to these facts, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times continues to describe the Gulag as, quote, the largest system of death camps in modern history, unquote. Almost 1 million Gulag prisoners were released during World War II to serve in the military. The archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths for the 1935-53 period occurred during the war years, 41 to 45, mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the lot. Unburdened by any documentation. Wait, what the fuck is going on here? This is 79, and then it goes back to 78, and then it goes to 79 again. Weird. There we go. Mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population. Some 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. In 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per 1,000. Kind of says it all right there, doesn't it? Should all Gulag inmates be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrested for political crimes, counter-revolutionary offenses, numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year. The vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offenses: murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. Total executions from 1921 to 1953, a 33-year span, inclusive, were 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by the researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated with Western capitalist invasion during the White Army atrocities and the subsequent White Guard Army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, and probably German SS prisoners. Won't somebody think of the Nazis? In any case, the killing of political opponents were not in the millions or tens of millions, which is not to say that the actual number was either inconsequential or justifiable. The three historians who studied our heretofore secret Gulag records concluded that the number of victims were far less than usually claimed in the West. This finding is ridiculed by anti-communist liberal Adam Hochschild, who prefers to repeat Churchill's story about Stalin's fingers. New York Times, 5/8/96. Like many others, Hochschild has no trouble accepting the undocumented speculations about the Gulag, but much difficulty accepting the documented figures drawn from NKVD archives. Where did the Gulag victims go? Some Russian anti-communist writers, such as Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, and many U.S. anti-communist liberals, like Anne Applebaum, maintained that the Gulag existed right down to the last days of communism. If so, where did it disappear to? After Stalin's death in 1953, more than half of the Gulag inmates were freed, according to the study of NKVD files previously cited. But if so many others remained incarcerated, why have they not materialized? When the communist states were overthrown, where were the half-starved hordes pouring out of the internment camps with their tales of travail? One of the last remaining Soviet labor camps, Perm 35, was visited in 1989 by Republican Congressman and again in 1990 by French journalists. See Washington Post 11/28/89 and National Geographic 3/90, respectively. Both parties found only a few dozen prisoners, some of whom were identified as outright spies. Others were refuseniks, who had been denied the right to immigrate. Prisoners worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for $40 a month. What of the supposed vast numbers of political prisoners said to exist in other communist totalitarian police states of Eastern Europe? Why no evidence of their mass release in the post-communist era? And where are the mass of political prisoners in Cuba? Asked about this, Professor Alberto Prieto of the University of Havana pointed out that even a recent State Department report on human rights showed hundreds of people being tortured, killed, or disappeared in almost all the Latin American countries, but mentions only 6 alleged political prisoners in reference to Cuba. People's Weekly World, 2/26/1994. If there were mass atrocities right down to the last days of communism, why did not the newly installed anti-communist regimes seize the opportunity to bring erstwhile communist rulers to justice? Why no Nuremberg-style public trials documenting widespread atrocities? Why were not hundreds of party leaders and security officials and thousands of camp guards rounded up and tried for the millions they supposedly exterminated? The best the West Germans could do was charge East German leader Erich Honecker, several other officers, and 7 border guards with shooting people who tried to escape over the Berlin Wall. A serious charge, but hardly indicative of a gulag. Authorities in Western Capitalist Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, did contrive a charge of treason, quote unquote, against persons who served as officials, military officers, soldiers, judges, attorneys, and others in the now defunct German Democratic Republic, a sovereign nation that once had full standing in the United Nations, and most of whose citizens had never been subjects of the FRG. As of 1996, more than 300 treason, quote-unquote, cases had been brought to trial, including a former GDR intelligence chief, a defense minister, and 6 generals, all indicated for carrying out what were their legal duties under the constitution and laws of the GDR. In some instances, fighting fascism and CIA sabotage. Many defendants were eventually acquitted, but a number were sentenced to prison. What we witness here is the Nuremberg trials in reverse. Reds put on trial for their anti-fascist efforts by West German friendly-to-fascism prosecutors, using retroactive application of FRG penal law for GDR citizens. As of the beginning of 1997, several thousand more trials were expected. In 1995, Miroslav Stefan, the former secretary of the Prague Communist Party, was sentenced to 2.5 years for ordering Czech police to use tear gas and water cannons against demonstrators in 1988. Is this the best example of bloodthirsty red oppression that the capitalist restorationists in Czechoslovakia could find? An action that does not even qualify as a crime in most Western nations? In 1996, 12 elderly Stalin-era political policemen were sentenced to prison for having beaten and mistreated political prisoners over 50 years earlier, during the communist takeover after World War II. San Francisco Chronicle, 3/9/1996. Again, one might wonder why post-communist leaders seeking to bring the communist tyrants to justice could find nothing more serious to prosecute than a police assault case from a half-century before. Most of those incarcerated in the Gulag were not political prisoners. and the same appears to be true of inmates in other communist states. In 1989, when the millionaire playwright Václav Havel became president of Czechoslovakia, he granted amnesty to about 2/3 of the country's prison population, which numbered not in the millions, but in the thousands. Havel assumed that most of those incarcerated under communism were victims of political repression and therefore deserved release. He and his associates were dismayed to discover that a good number were experienced criminals. Hey, when that happens. Who lost no time in resuming their unsavory pursuits. New York Times, 12/18/1991. Memories of Maldevelopment. In Chapter 2, I discuss the role of popular revolution in advancing the condition of humankind. That analysis would apply as well to communist revolutions, and it is worth reiterating in the present context. We hear a great deal about the crimes of communism, but almost nothing about its achievements. The communist governments inherited societies burdened with age-old legacy of economic exploitation and maldevelopment. Much of pre-communist Eastern Europe, as well as pre-revolutionary Russia and China, was in effect a third world region with widespread poverty and almost non-existent capital formation. Most rural transportation was still by horse and wagon. The devastation of World War II added another heavy layer of misery upon the region, reducing hundreds of villages and many cities to rubble. It was the communists and their allies who rebuilt those societies. While denounced in the US press for leaving their economies in bad shape, in fact, the Reds left the economy of Eastern Europe in far better condition than they found it. The same was true of China. Henry Rosamond Jr. notes that when the communists liberated Shanghai from the US-supported reactionary Kuomintang regime in 1949, about 20% of that city's population, an estimated 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. Every morning, there were special street crews, quote, whose sole task was to gather up the corpses of children and adults and the elderly who had been murdered during the night or had been abandoned and died of cold, disease, and starvation. Z Magazine, October 1995. During the years of Stalin's reign, the Soviet nation made dramatic gains in literacy, industrial wages, healthcare, and women's rights. These accomplishments usually go unmentioned when the Stalinist era is discussed. To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did. In Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba, revolutionary communism created a life for the massive people that was far better than the wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonizers, and Western capitalists.
To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did work, and it worked for hundreds of millions of people.
The end result was a dramatic improvement in living conditions for hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or since witnessed in history. State socialism transformed desperately poor countries into modernized societies in which everyone had enough food, clothing, and shelter. While elderly people had secure pensions, and where all children and many adults went to school, and no one was denied medical attention. Some of us from poor families who carry around the hidden injuries of class are much impressed by these achievements and are unwilling to dismiss them as merely economistic. But what if the democratic rights that these people were denied? In fact, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, These countries had known little political democracy in the days before communism. Russia was a czarist autocracy, Poland a rightist dictatorship with concentration camps of its own, Albania an Italian fascist protectorate as early as 1927, Cuba a US-sponsored dictatorship, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were outright fascist regimes allied with Nazi Germany in World War II. So what democracy are they talking about restoring? Then there were the distorting effects that unremitting capitalist encirclement had upon the building of socialism. Throughout its entire 73-year history of counter-revolutionary invasion, civil war, forced industrialization, Stalinist purges and deportations, Nazi conquest, Cold War, and nuclear arms race, the Soviet Union did not know one day of peaceful development. In the attempt to maintain military parity with the United States, the Soviets took on crushing defensive costs that seriously depleted their civilian economy. In addition, they faced monetary boycott, trade discrimination, and technological embargo from the West. The people who lived under communism endured chronic shortages, long lines, poor quality goods and services, and many other problems. They wanted a better life, and who could blame them? Without capitalist encirclement, they would have had a better chance of solving more of their internal problems. All of this is not to deny the very real deficiencies of the communist systems. Here I want to point out that much of the credit for the deformation and overthrow of communism should go to the Western forces that tirelessly dedicated themselves to that task, using every possible means of political, economic, military, and diplomatic aggression to achieve a success that will continue to cost the people of the world dearly. There you go.